Welcome to For the Record, which is a conversation series where we talk to music heads about their stories and the music that makes them. It's great to connect, CY. It's great to have you here.
Thank you. Hello.
Hello, indeed. Um, yeah, so we always start these conversations at the beginning. Just get a sense of you and your story, where you're from, and when your relationship with music started.
Okay. Well, I'll start at the very, very beginning,
Cool.
which is my parents. My father came from Hong Kong, and at the time that he came to the U.S., he had, as a high schooler, become sort of the premier concert pianist in Hong Kong, and
Wow.
went to the Royal Academy of Music, and from there got a scholarship to Yale to study in their conservatory. And that brought him to the U.S. And my mother was a high schooler who got a scholarship to study music at University in upstate New York.
Cool.
So they met in the Northeast of the U.S. And I was born in the late '60s. It's a product of these two people who had, I think, deep relationships with music.
Hmm.
Um, and so my sort of childhood was spent hearing my father practice piano in the background as this continuous soundtrack of,
Hmm.
you know, the great. But I
Right.
particularly was in love with Chopin.
Hmm.
That was like nocturnes that literally put me to bed.
Hmm.
So it was like a vibe. Fast forwarding through that, I grew up mostly in a classical music environment. I played the cello, studied piano, but when I went to college, I kind of went off the rails. Got into
Hmm.
college radio, started DJing,
Cool.
and this is like the late '80s, so like house, hip hop were sort of like my soul food. And I was sort of doing mobile parties, a lot of just like um, kind of like the core of youth music culture. And at the
Hmm.
same time, I was studying architecture and computer science, and it all sort of like merged. Or I wanted it badly to merge, but as it turns out, in the early '90s, if you work in software, you're writing like productivity software. Um, and so my first job out of college was at Microsoft, working on what would become Microsoft Outlook.
Hmm.
Which in retrospect is crazy because like why would you put a kid fresh out of college to work on like or the software you'd run a corporation based on? Like my concept of things like scheduling appointments was ridiculous. Um, so you basically have a completely ignorant person building things for a very deeply entrenched industry. And I'll come back to this later because I think it's a metaphor for a lot of what's gone on in music tech
Cool. Yeah.
forever.
Mhm.
Um, and then from that I went to Real Networks where I worked on some game software that they were building alongside their sort of real audio phenomenon. Napster came up around then, so I spent a lot of time thinking about how music was changing from the time where I'd amassed a collection of like thousands of records and CDs, and Napster sort of blew my mind as far as like the accessibility of listening to anything without having to pay for it and breaking shrink wrap.
Mhm.
And so around that time, I also met my co-founder of Music Nerd, Carl. And again, I'll come back to this later, but we basically bonded over Napster and house music. So from there, Carl actually went on to work at MusicNet and Rhapsody. So he went down to sort of like the streaming media the hype train. And I ended up working at a company a startup that was building photo sharing software. So I kind of got my head around the world of just like how people engage socially with photos, and at the confluence of like digital cameras, high speed networks, um, and that kind of transforming into like mobile phones, ubiquitous internet, great cameras. So I kind of rode that train the same way I sort of like had a music context and then kind of had Napster do a huge mindfuck. Um, I also witnessed the same thing with photography, where
Mm.
when I had a kid, digital cameras were just coming out. I was taking photos, posting them on Flickr, and then I worked at the startup where that became essentially this Instagram fast feedback loop of you take pictures, apply a filter, you post it immediately, as opposed to I'll pick up these photos and get double prints and share them with my
Right.
friends.
Right.
Um, so Carl and I both actually ended up working at that startup. It was called Smilebox. Um, and after Smilebox, it had a sort of a nice exit. I worked at Amazon briefly, but Carl and I reconnected about 10 years ago and decided to start doing some R&D in the music space.
Hmm.
Because, you know, this is like, I would say like 2013,
Mhm.
and Napster at that point was literally like it had spawned a decade, over a decade before, and all these sort of conversations we'd had at Real Networks about how frictionless distribution was going to change everything. None of it had really come to pass. We're all basically still using versions of iTunes. So Carl and I kind of looked at each other and thought, if no one's going to implement the things that we thought would happen, it's going to have to be us.
Mhm.
And so that's for the past 10 years. We initially, our working title for that venture, it still is the working title, it's ex DJs. Um, and we basically thought we could solve the problem through software, building new user interfaces. And so like, it's like the hedge, like the evil thing was iTunes.
Mhm.
And we thought like by merging these trends of like um, streaming media, like at the time it was SoundCloud, Instagram, Twitter, Bandcamp, and Patreon. Those were sort of like the things that had come up, which made it seem like there's a workflow here to get from liking a song to liking an artist and supporting that artist directly. And no app is built around that workflow. Like, let's get, it's that, 100,000, 10,000 true fans model, right? There's
Mhm.
nothing that supports that workflow. And because, I built software my entire career, it's like software is the hammer. I want to like try to fix everything in software. So
Right.
when we started, all these services had API support, with the exception of Bandcamp. We'll come back to that later. And so naively, we're like, let's just like mash these things together. So while you're listening to music, instead of looking at the cover art, you can look at the person's Instagram. You can see what
Mhm.
they've tweeted. You can get to know their social networks around who they're who they're retweeting, who they're following. All those things that SoundCloud actually did a great job of like meshing together. The concept of like a listener is there with fellow listeners. They can engage with each other. And the artist is also a listener. Like they're all peers in SoundCloud. They can all get to know each other. They can look at their profiles, understand people's preferences, look at each other's likes. It was actually really beautiful. And we're like, let's just add the existing social layers on top of that so that the participants don't have to do anything extra. We're
Mhm.
just juxtaposing things they're already doing so that when you're listening, you can follow that curiosity really, really easily. It's a mobile app. You can just tap around. You don't have to open 100 tabs and start Googling the crap out of this. Who is this person? How do they make such amazing music? And what else have they made? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. Yeah.
It's like, so that's where we kind of like came up with this concept of music nerd, where to some degree, anyone who's grown up around music enough to fall deeply in love with it, they carry that with them forever. And it's like a music nerdiness that I think it's it has a couple of core drives, which is like I found something, I want to go down the rabbit hole, and I want to kind of like know everything there is to know about that until I run out of interest. It's just a natural self-indulgent behavior that comes from a place of love.
Mhm.
And so we were building the software, experimenting with these APIs were incredibly accessible. If you go into the Instagram for Music Nerd XYZ and kind of like scroll all the way to the beginning, you'll see video clips of this thing that we were making.
Cool.
But as it turns out, when you use other people's APIs, you get fucked when they change their minds for whatever reason it might be.
Yeah.
So we were like, first it was SoundCloud, we're like, okay, fine, we'll build on top of Spotify. And then, Spotify stuff gets deprecated. Instagram like cuts off access to its API. So, after about 5, 6 years of this, and mind you, Carl and I are doing this full time. It's essentially XDJs is run as a very cheap, self-funded startup. Let's put it that way. Um, but it gives us the agency to build whatever the heck we think should be built.
Right. Totally.
And it I think by the time we got shut down by an API for like the fifth, sixth time, we were basically we can't solve this with software. And at the same time, like we'd been following crypto for a while just for fun, shits and grins, since crypto kitties. Like art NFTs were rolling out. Carl was like collecting some of these NFTs, so he was getting his head around the culture of NFT collection and how it related to the collecting of tangible objects. And then music NFTs came out, so like catalog and sound were on the cusp of launching, and I started getting my head into it. I started collecting. I felt that back then there was actually a very kind of like a vibrant culture around collecting because there were like a lot of stuff was going on in Twitter Spaces, and you kind of
Mhm.
got to know each other and people's tastes, and that community was forming in the same way that like early SoundCloud felt like a place to go to where you could hang out with other geeks who were into the same weird shit that you were into. And what I was also noticing is there were people making music I thought was like not terribly good, but they were also really, really interesting people. So
Mhm.
seeing creators kind of on the come up and kind of getting their heads around shit, forming all at once, it's like punk energy.
Hmm. Mhm.
And I, I felt that. I felt that. And and so at the point where like this is when I've been rambling on for a while, but this is now like maybe 2 years ago. We've stopped working on the app. It was just untenable
Hmm.
to stand up other people's APIs, and we then really leaned into like figuring out what is this new culture is developing. How do we understand the drives, try to see where it's going, and then start over again to build the right software around that, build those workflows. So I'd like to say right now, Music Nerd, which is sort of the more public working title for our project, is it's a full time venture. Carl and I are both immersed in trying to understand and to some degree, I don't know if it's like influence or immerse ourselves in the culture in a way where we can figure out what the workflows that work are and then build software around that to support it.
Mhm. Cool. Yeah. Thank you, CY. There were about 10,000 things you said that I wanted to come off and have like individual conversations on. I took so many notes. It was really interesting. Thank you for giving us your story. Um, yeah, I mean, I think just to echo a little bit of what you were saying, like, this idea of coming from a place of love, I think is so important and has been obfuscated, I think, by a lot of, the technologies that have tried to support it or have had intentions around supporting it and like these like the API issue that you've had and kind of a lack of an open source etho that has, prevented these loops from forming from, a moment of
Yeah,
discovery to engaging more deeply and cultivating community around a person to like actual patronage and monetization. And it's really important for those to be connected because if they're all siloed around walled gardens, then um, that connectivity and community is never going to take place. And then you see, in Web3, some of these solutions potentially, and like not having the same API problem, being able to build, and ideas of,
right,
of like provenance and agency that
right.
that can transcend some of, the individual platforms. I think that's really exciting. It is very punk. It's like a punk technology, which I think that was thing I read about by a music X piece by Martin Walraven, who's in the audience right now. I thought the idea of punk technology was really cool, and that definitely feels relevant here. Um,
Yeah. Punk is almost like I feel like it's the ultimate, or maybe it's like a human pattern of like a bunch of people who don't exactly know what they're doing, all
hmm,
doing their own thing within their own heads, and then finding each other, and everyone's like kind of it's a beautiful combination of not knowing what you're doing but doing it anyway because it
mhm,
feels right.
yeah,
And it happens all the time. Like even cryptography, there was like an early movement of like CryptoPunks who are just like
yeah,
fucking with crypto.
hmm,
But eventually it productizes, it becomes things, then it gets hidden under a layer of technology so that everybody can use that thing or indulge in the culture without having to like play the whole journey, live the whole journey themselves. They just reap the benefits. It's a
totally.
constant cycle.
It is the extractive layer that comes from scale and misaligned incentive structures. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
frustrating.
yeah. But it's also a human pattern. It's going to happen again and again. Like I've lived through it multiple times, so I can, as the old guy in the room, I feel like I can say like, we've seen this shit. It's going to happen. There's going to be
Yeah.
another refactor. We're going to punks will rise again, create new culture. That's going to go mainstream. We're all going to hate
Mhm.
it, start over, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess the hope is that, like, throughout this, throughout this process as we continue to recycle these ideas, go from, from punk to mainstream, are we making overall progress,
Yes,
as a
yes.
human
That
culture,
that
as
that's
society?
Absolutely. Yeah,
That's
yeah,
the
like,
part.
we all humans have basic needs, we all need to build things that get them met, but, like, what are the power structures that form? Like, what are who controls the direction? Things like that. I think those things are really in flux, but at the end of the
Mhm.
day, like, we're still gonna end up with, like, dating apps. We're still gonna end up with, like, bullying. We're still gonna end up with the same
Mhm.
sort of, like, shit we complain about, but it'll be in another format, and maybe there'll be other ways of managing it.
Right. Yeah, indeed. Well, I'm gonna leave that there for now and come back to some things you said earlier on in your music life.
Mhm.
Um, and I would love to hear more, about the music that you were playing early on when you started playing cello and piano. I mean, and I would also love to know if you still play.
Yes.
And then, once you got into college radio, I would love to hear more about that experience. College radio has a near and dear place in my heart. I was a music director of
Mhm.
my own college radio station, and I think it has. I think it plays such an important role, in the music industry, and is a model that we should lean into a bit more and just hear, a little bit more about like what you were listening to and what you were playing at that time too.
Yeah, so short answer to that question, I neither play the cello nor piano anymore,
Mm,
uh, and I have feelings about that, because on one hand, I remember a stage, while I was learning it where I felt a certain resentment towards having to master this instrument.
mhm,
Um, like, I loved playing in orchestras, I loved playing in chamber music groups, but I hated practicing. And what I find really fascinating is, like, to master a medium, you still have to practice it with it. But like the
right.
act of having to, gain the muscle control and understand sort of these, mind body relationships to play an instrument. On one hand, that's conceptually beautiful, but it takes 10,000 hours to
Mhm.
get around something. And if you really don't love the art of playing it, it actually kind of sucks. So I love that technology has like simplified that so much. The fact that you can go, you know, when I think about college radio and DJing in particular, that's just like, let's cut out the middleman. You don't
Mhm.
have to learn. You don't have to master some instrument that was designed centuries ago to play music that was composed centuries ago to have a good time, right?
Yeah.
And I learned, I had mentors that taught me how to like scratch and cut and curate and set up a good set, how to get the crowd moving and things like that. And yes, that is a skill set, but like literally, it takes I don't know 100 times longer to learn how to play the cello well than
Yeah.
to rock a party well, right?
Yeah. It's true.
So that's to me, that's a beautiful thing about how technology is democratized or just made so accessible. One's inner need to make and vibe to music.
Mhm.
Uh, and we can argue all day about how that's like the value of music has been affected by what has essentially been the gatekeeping of having to learn an instrument into this incredible way of just like this is how we communicate with each other, right?
Yeah.
I can pass, like turntable FM, like yeah, everyone's a DJ. Some of you suck, but the fact that like we're changing places, it's a multiplayer game, is like amazing, right? This we're having a great time. It isn't that sort of like the net result we're trying to get to. It's like just vibing together.
Right.
Um, okay, I've lost the thread about what we were talking about, but I at least answer the question of like, do I still play the cello? The answer is no. Uh,
That was an incredible thread. Yeah, yeah, it made me think of it. There was a recent there was a recent there was a recent quote because music tech or Techstars Music, just recently announced that it was, going to close, and or they're going to restructure anyways, or
right,
reconceptualize, their approach. And there was a quote in there about how instruments are going to become obsolete essentially because they're going to be replaced by software, which uh, was a bit was a bit off-putting. I think speaks to kind of what you're saying. Like it's much easier, to fulfill that kind of inner need that we have to make
right,
music to communicate through music one way or another without having to spend 10,000 hours learning an instrument.
right.
Um, it lacks some of the nuance, I think, around like all the beautiful things that come, from learning how to play an instrument and also, communicating through that with a
Yes,
group of people.
yes.
Um, but anyways, I think the thread of where I was going to is I'd love to hear more about like some of the music that you were playing on the radio. like, in those early house hip hop days, like some of the,
Yeah,
the artists or albums or tracks that you remember being most resonant?
yeah. I my favorite memories of college radio is like basically going into the room where all the vinyl was and just
Mm,
kind of flipping through it. And promos were arriving daily. And part of the workflow of college radio is like whoever shows up gets to go through the boxes and boxes of records and just like see what comes up. And then like pick a few out that look interesting, drop the needle on a few, decide whether you want to work them in a show or tell another one of the DJs about it because it's up their alley. There's like the community that comes from that. And honestly, I think that really broadened my perception and understanding of like how wide the variety of music there was out there. Because prior to that, it was like again, you see end caps at the record store, and that's sort of,
mhm,
and you listen to the radio. That's the universe of like what music is being made. The college
mhm,
radio just sort of blew that wide open for me.
mhm,
So at the time, I was, really. I mean, it sounds stupid now, but like there was not a whole lot of like new wave being played on the radio. So like
mm,
things like New Order, Erasure, Depeche Mode. I mean, there's Depeche Mode had sort of this music video sort of entree into mainstream, sort of like at least a high schooler's understanding of music. But like being able to delve into that, finding the imports that were available that were on the shelf, that was sort of like realizing there were other pockets of the world where there was just like a whole different vocabulary of music, and then it
mhm,
was just like sort of traveling around it. Like with house, that the huge mind fuck was realizing that all this stuff that was all imported vinyl actually came from Chicago or Detroit.
mm.
It was like how the hell did that happen? Right? It has to be laundered, culturally laundered, to come back for us to
Yeah.
then fetishize it. Um,
Mm,
but yeah, like that sort of was my bread and butter. Was like the I mean, what's crazy now is like I think about the music I listened to back then. I can hear it in my head. But these are like on white label records. It's like people didn't talk about the artist. House was just a vibe.
right.
And like honestly, now that it's decades later, I could be like, I'll tell you what bin is the music I listen to in
Mhm,
in at storage at home, but I can't right off the bat say like, okay, this was like early Carl Cox or this was blah 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 blah. Like I have a lot of like stuff on Excel that I loved. Um, this touches on another sort of like interesting issue around like if you love music enough, like having to remember everything becomes like a chore at some point.
yeah, indeed.
And there's this concept of like the aging music nerd where like when you're young you have infinite time to remember everything, like you're in it. But then as you get older it's like I have a job, like I've got
Yeah,
kids, I've got other responsibilities, like the amount of space in my head for music goes from like this to
yeah,
like this. It's like a single digit percentage of what it once was. And
yeah,
even now, if you're like, what are you listening to, Sue? I'd be like, okay, let me go and check my Spotify, like the playlist that it generates automatically for heavy rotation. Because those actually work really well for me. But can I tell you, I mean, the names offhand, I can tell you what I'm listening to now. Is I'm in love with Kenya Grace because I watched her blow up on Instagram real time and see her that song "Strangers" that's now just like everywhere in social media as the backdrop to people doing stupid shit in cars. Like I saw that soundtrack get adopted real time, and that to me has been fascinating. It's like yes, it's sort of like liquid drum and bass kind of melodic with vocals. It's a little. I'm almost embarrassed to say I like it, but I love it because I saw it happen. I saw it
mm,
happen. Like it's a girl in her bedroom making these somewhat self-conscious reels of her just like hitting sample pads and then singing in this sort of like very singing in a bedroom kind of voice, and then having it become the soundtrack to like drifting videos
yeah,
is like amazing. Um, and
yeah.
then I'll just go off and well, actually, I'll stop because I feel like I've gone beyond answering your question about to enter a new topic. But go ahead.
No, that's right. That's right. Let's go there. But I was gonna say, yeah, I mean, there's something to like the experimental the of like the experiential aspect of that, of seeing somebody from the beginning, watching them evolve, being like, I was there, and when that
Yes.
happened, I was at the first show,
Yeah.
or I saw, the first Instagram live, that they
Yeah.
did.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and I think also like in terms of the role that music plays in your life as much as, you know, like our teenage or 20-something-year-old self would like it, to maintain, like 80% of our time forever.
Yeah,
It's not true, and, there have been, I think a lot of studies that say, like, by the time you hit 30, like, your music discovery, like, you discovering new music is going to drop off a cliff, it's never
yeah. It
you're not gonna
basically
regain it.
you get stuck in your college or high school version of yourself, and
Right.
eventually it
Basically.
becomes really cringy when people ask you what are you listening to, and you're like, oh, that thing
New
I
wave.
listened to 20 years ago, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, I'm curious though, how else you discover music these days? Like, what are your go-to what are your go-to sources?
For a while, yeah, I mean, it varies. Like I'll openly say, discover music totally works for me. And prior to like kind of like delving into the music NFT scene, that was my primary means of music discovery. And the app that we had built
Mhm.
was built to work with me with Discover Weekly. So you would get basically it's like being at the radio station. You show up, there's like boxes of new records that have come in, and you're just like flipping through them. And Discover Weekly is like, hey, there's some algorithms that have like, suggested these things. And I just kind of flip through them. So early versions of Crush, which was the app that we were building in like 2015 to 2018, 19, it was you could basically load up either your SoundCloud stream or Discover Weekly and just flip through songs. And then while you're flipping through and listening, the app would deliver you the latest posts from that artist's Instagram or their Twitter or their tweets. And you could see who else they were following. You could delve into their playlists. It was just trying to do all the work for you, where ordinarily, you don't have that 80% time. The
Right,
app will do the work to kind of like give you to contextualize what you're listening to, so that
right.
maybe that artist song not that great, but they look really hot. Sure, I'll spend more time listening. So that sort of like correspondence. So it's like that's what MTV did. Like you'll
Mhm.
listen to someone if they look amazing, even if their music's not amazing, and eventually with enough listens, it might grow on you. It'll just become part of your remembrance of that time, that nostalgia thing, which ultimately
Mhm.
makes us all love music we actually hate. Um, but it's all part of like I think the human experience and how we relate to each other and relate to using whole culture as a common thread.
Right.
Um, yeah,
Yeah, yeah, no, I think that's important, like, whether, the additional context, is aesthetic or, like, any other piece of context about the person that we can relate to.
yeah,
It's like one other potential point of connection that we have where, the artist, the creator, the people involved in the creation of the music are at least at the forefront and in control, of their presence and of our understanding of them as listeners and potential fans, rather than having,
right.
their likeness, their context to be, kind of abstracted away from them by, big lean back streaming platforms. So,
Right. But I think it also speaks to how artists are sort of like more holistically creative than I think people who say they like music are inclined to see them, right?
hmm,
Like I think of Will Smith as an early example of someone who was like, yes, he made kind of like corny, funny music, but then he crossed the line into television and then movies, and then suddenly he's a dramatic actor. And you know him for many things. I'm
right.
sure if you talk to someone now about Will Smith who's like a teenager, they'll be like, "Oh yeah, he was in this movie," as opposed to, "Oh yeah, parents just don't understand. Love that track."
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the bigger picture of like how artists find independent support from their fans, which is like a long-term fan wants to follow an artist's journey where the artist may not want to be typecast in the media the fan found them as, right? um, I think Black Dave is a great example of an artist who's also creates great content around music, has great sort of like thinking around music, where to me that's part of the Black Dave ethos. And I love him not just for his music. Actually, I love him primarily for his thinking,
Hmm,
and the music is like just part of who he is. And I think we're all like that as humans. We're all creatives. Some of us are able to parlay that into things that other people want to consume, and that's a shifting landscape because, like, people just change over time, including that person who's making stuff. And it sucks to be the one hit wonder, that one thing hit, and everything. Like nobody will pay attention to anything else you're making. And it, crossing visual barriers, like, oh, like, well, I think again, like that between film and music and writing and all these things. Um, when a fan loves an artist and wants to support them directly, I'd like to think that that fan actually loves everything that the artist stands for, like their
Mhm.
ethos. And the things
Mhm.
that artist makes are just kind of like instantiations or artifacts of that ethos.
Mhm.
And fans are along for the ride because they believe in the artist, not just because they like that one song and hope that artist makes more of that one song.
Mhm. Yeah, no, it's interesting thinking about the different types of relationships that you can potentially have with musicians because, on the one hand, you might be attracted to somebody for all of those other things. And then there are other examples where you may love someone's music, but you can't stand any of those other things, or none of those
Right,
things actually resonate with your personal views. Um, like people like Morrissey, for instance, come to mind as like,
right. Yeah,
I mean, I love the Smiths, like their music is great, but it's that kind of classic conversation is like, to what extent do we separate, the artist from the art? At what point
right.
do they become, two different things? At what point, like are they the same
Yeah,
thing?
I think, but like if there was a young Morrissey, I'd be like, yeah, I'd buy that track on iTunes for 99 cents.
Mm.
But would I support his Patreon? Fuck no, right?
Yeah.
And so like that's sort of like I think what's really interesting about what's been happening lately within so the the NFT realm, the blockchain. So the thing that's been happening on the blockchain is that I feel like there's different ways of engaging with an artist, whether it's like on a
Mhm,
like in
mhm,
in, in a world of shrink wrap stuff, you're just buying stuff from them and they're hoping you'll buy more of the stuff after they're done with it. But in a there's like a moving, it's like a conveyor belt of like things that artists make, and that just their presence is a continuous sort of like stream of um, them being them, right? And
mhm,
there's product I think to engage with them on that level. Whether it's like at one point it's just like okay, you can watch the stream on Twitch or whatever, but it goes to like if they're doing a project, I think Jamie. Sound of Factory in the audience. And like is a really good example of like there's an album, and then he's made the album, uh, and you can get on board as an executive producer to go along for the ride of witnessing and being a part of the release of that album with other people who also believe in what Sound of Actors has made and will make in the future. It's almost like interactive performance art, right? You can go along for the ride, and that's a very different way of engaging than like, okay, this album's going to drop. Hope you buy it,
yeah,
right? It's now spread over it. Like, and to me, this is sort of like I hope the future of independent artists and independent fans supporting those artists, where there's like a stream of things that come out. There's ways to participate where you're not subscribing per se, where you're like, I at some point you might decide, oh my god, that's still hitting my credit card. I need to cancel. But there's like waves or seasons of things where people want to go along for the ride, and there's still these are still products. You have to promote them. You have to like support them as the person who's making them. You still have to engage the people who are showing up for it. But it feels like a sustainable workflow.
right. Yeah, no, I mean, I think world building is something that's talked about, a lot in the on-chain music space, or in the on-chain space, if you want to call it that. I think overall in general of people, having the agency and the autonomy to be as creative, as they want with both their art and the way that it is placed into the world,
Mhm.
um, which is really great because it's not something that you can do very easily in like the platform economy that we have where everything is kind of flattened into a one size fits all model, when
Right.
clearly it doesn't.
Right. And that's what I love about stuff being on chain is the platforms just render what's on chain. So if you don't like a platform because it casts everybody as like, okay, we're just listening to music, like
Right.
not Spinamp or Future Tape. It's like that's a very sort of like listener's view of the world. But you could also look at it from like Like gallery, if someone's built a gallery, if you look at it through any sort of future platform that just lets you visualize NFTs in a different way, that could be a very different way of perceiving an artist or body of work.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, yeah, from there, I'd love to transition a little bit into talking more about the music that you're listening to these days. I am going to ask you about that.
Yes, yes.
um, who are three artists of note that you've heard for the first time, in about the last year?
Ah, artists of note that I've heard for the first time. Okay, so this is the case. I have to cheat. I have to go to Spotify
You're allowed. You can
and
cheat.
look at. I'm going to look at what I've been. You can totally tell I've really prepared hardcore for this. Because otherwise, I'd be like, yes, off the top of my head. Okay, if I go into my liked songs, um, so I talked earlier about Kenya Grace, uh, Victoria Monet. Uh, I I mean, she's been in music for years, but I listened to her Jaguar 2 album because it came up on my Discover Weekly, and
Mm,
that's on heavy rotation for me. There's that sort of like I don't know how I categorize her. Like I have like a very deep emotional nostalgia relationship with Erica Badu. So anyone who comes
mm,
within her sphere of sound or vibe, I'm up for it. So I've been listening to a lot of her. Um, I've been listening to New Jeans, the it's K-pop. I'm not going to call it trash because it's really well produced, but it is kind of trashy. My son caught me listening to it in the car a few days ago, and I felt really exposed because he was just completely like harshing on me for listening to K-pop. But it's quality K-pop, I have to say. What else? Forrest Mortefi, an artist that I also work with, um,
Oh,
has been
nice. I know
dropping
Force is great.
bangers. And I love I love the producer he works with, and I love his voice, and I love how his voice. Forrest uh, is a trans man, and so there's part of his body of work is his voice, but it's back when he was queer, like you can kind of track the change in his voice as part of his transition. So that journey is instantiated in his music as well
Mm,
as his body.
mm,
And to me, that's kind of this. It's like several levels of art moving at once.
mhm. Yeah, no, that's really beautiful. I love that. Um, all right, here's the next question for you. Most
Okay.
underappreciated. What is the most underappreciated artist from your favorite music decade?
Um, Underappreciated. I mean, it's hard to say. Like, but first, what's top of mind for me is Kings of Convenience,
Mm,
which is like Erlen Oy and I forget his partner's name or the other half of Kings of Convenience offhand. Um, but I went to their live show a few days ago, and it's like a folk. They're a folk group from Norway, which if I say it like that, sounds super obscure, but they're like really polished, really produced, and it was a sold out show. So clearly they've got a huge following, but like nobody knows about it in the
mhm,
sense of, like I don't know anybody else um, who who gets excited about this band. When I showed up at the show, like everybody knew all the words to the song. Um, so it's hard to say, like in a mainstream world or like within the like the music NFT world that I spend most of my time in, like nobody knows Kings of Convenience that I know of.
mhm,
Maybe
mhm,
they do, they just don't talk about it. But I feel like everyone should be talking about them because they're amazing. Um, and what struck me about seeing them live is there's kind of my contemporaries. Like Erwin said when he was on stage, he's 47 years old, and it's like I've been aging together with them and seeing them, and actually also seeing their artistry and the ease with which they put on that live show, speaks to like, okay, there's a difference between an artist who spends those 10,000 hours mastering an instrument to the point where it's just an extension of their body versus a Kate Grace. I don't know how many hours she spent in her bedroom with her equipment, but it's not 10,000 hours.
Right.
probably. But I love her music just as much. You know, so I find that really fascinating juxtaposition.
Mhm.
But for anyone who's listening, if you haven't played any Kings of Convenience, like go there. It's amazing.
Cool. Um, yeah, no, I know what you're talking about. Just seeing somebody who, like, when they're playing guitar, when they're playing piano, it's as if, they just grown another limb, and, it's as
Yeah,
natural, just kind of waving it as, about it as it is to make music on it. Um,
right.
so I'm curious if, with Kings of Convenience, after having seen them, you believe, a lot more people should be listening to them than they are currently.
Yeah.
Kind of now going back to earlier in our conversation, if you were to take it upon yourself to try and amplify Kings of Convenience, to put the word out, to get more people listening, what would you do? How would you go about it today?
What's my budget?
Yeah, I guess that's the right question.
Because if it was
Um,
my job, I could make it happen, but it's not my job. So
mhm,
I'll tell a friend about it if I think, oh, you like Simon and Garfunkel? Like,
mhm,
check this out, right?
mhm,
That's easy.
mhm.
But if I had a couple $1,000,000, I could run a bunch of really effective targeted ads to a bunch of aging folk music lovers who are on Facebook and probably suck a couple of them in. But it would make no financial sense, right?
Yeah,
It really
yeah,
wouldn't.
that's true. That's true. Unfortunately, yeah, it comes down to financial sense.
Well, yeah,
Or
it's this attention economy we live in, and how bad we want to be known, as opposed to letting. I mean, yes, there are algorithms are involved, but it's like algorithms are the organic ways molecules move or bits move these days,
mhm,
and it's um, they're efficient for for certain things that fit within where people's interests already lie, but for I'll go on a little bit of a tangent. Like, I feel like there's an
please do.
ideal amount of friction that it takes to discover something for it to really stick with you if it resonates, right? If you feel like you found it
Mm,
kind of on your own, then it makes it more special. It becomes part of your own story, as opposed to
right.
someone just being like, if you listen to something that just popped up on the radio and you like it, there's no story there. Just like, yeah, this sounds good, right?
Mhm,
And and I feel like there's in a sort of a world of synthetic experience, you could actually articulate a product which is like, how do you serve up music with the right amount of friction, such that, or serve up any entertainment with the right amount of friction that it sticks with people after they've consumed it if they like it enough,
mm,
right? I found this. I searched for more information about it. I found out these little factoids that I'm going to share with you, other interested person, that's going to make you feel like, wow, see why you did a bunch of work to find this thing. I'm going to go listen to it too,
yeah,
because I trust your taste and you did
right,
work, so that
right.
I don't have to, and I can have similar taste to you, whatever that narrative might be. I'm saying it kind of mockingly, but I think it's real. Like,
Mhm,
we all have these stories that we want to tell people, and when you
totally.
create the right sort of like environment for those stories to be told, that helps a meme travel. I mean, does it
Mhm,
scale infinitely? No, but like, I think this is part of like what makes us human and what makes us feel like we want to share things, and when you're on the receiving side of that share, why you want to lean in and pay attention. It's like tasting notes when you go out and eat or drink a glass of wine. When you drink wine for the first time, it's like, this tastes like spoiled grape juice. But if someone like tells you what notes to listen for, and you're like, this person has clearly spent a lot of time drinking wine, I'm going to try to replicate the way they picture this in their mind's eye as they take a sip of it. Um, that sticks and that travels. Um, so that it's a bit of neither here nor there, but I feel like, yes, algorithms are not they serve up to a certain point, but you still have to generate the stories on top to
yeah,
make something really travel organically, and meaningfully to other people.
totally. Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, there's still a really important role for, the curator and the tastemaker to play. Um, and those, and as you said, like, you need an environment for, that type of person to exist, to be able to tell the stories on top of the algorithms. But unfortunately, convenience is at a premium, or everything is kind of ruled by convenience, and that tends to win out. And you don't have the same sort of crate digging experiences that you had when you were doing the work and you were actually discovering something, bringing it home with you, which was inciting more curiosity. Like just having that entire cycle that you could then
Right,
share with people as a curator, as a source, as a point of origin, to at least your story, with your connection to this music.
right, right. Yeah. I think a lot of that sort of impractical research that comes from curators that we love,
Hmm.
because we can't do it. We trust their taste from them spending time that probably doesn't make sense. At the expense of their relationships with their families and pets and whatnot. They've gone and like spent time immersing themselves in this, sea of amazing artistry where they picked out a few things for you. Like that's part of the narrative and also part of like the literal things that they deliver to you that you appreciate for as someone who follows a curator is
Hmm.
in some sense like we're replicating like the curator is serving the similar purpose as an algorithm of like doing a bunch of research so that you don't have to, you can just reap the benefits. But
Right.
in some sense like finding that curator becomes the meta problem that then it's like there was a time when people were like, oh, you're going to Tower Records and buying CDs. Well, I read Pitchfork,
Hmm.
so I'm buying the CDs that nobody talks about because I'm
Right.
one of the few people on dial-up internet or whatever the filter used to be at that time that made people feel more special by curating their curators.
Hmm.
Uh, I don't know. To me, the problem just it just moves around to different layers of abstraction.
Hmm.
Um, and coming back to the music earlier, where it's so much easier to create music now by just like grabbing a bunch of stems and matching them up and whatever. Um,
Hmm.
it's just like now when you make music, you're more like a creative director than you are a person who's mastering an instrument, and I think that's totally okay. I mean, you can still decide, you know what, I've become really good at like knowing the sound I want to make, and I'm going to go deep on like generating those sound. I'm going to go and like buy an old reel to reel to try to create a certain type of like distortion that comes from magnetic tape falling apart, right?
Hmm.
You can still traverse that, on your own terms. But the fact of the
Right.
matter is that you can, like the beauty of where we are right now, you can start anywhere on the line,
Right.
right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the augmented accessibility, I think, is really amazing. Like the more people that make music, that can make music, that can channel this inner need, to communicate with music, the better. I think they're. I think it's also important to consider, kind of the tiers of access, with how we consume music as well.
Yeah,
From it, I'm all for hobbyists being able to play around with music. Um, but when they're able to put music into the same system that is responsible for paying artists who are professional, and that's their job, that's their gig, that's what they do to make money, and they're all being paid out from the same big pot, like that, that's when it can become problematic.
yeah, yeah. Well, I think that pot is just broken, and this is why I feel like it makes no sense to try to fix it now because so much of that pot is encoded in legislation and rules that are you cannot. It's tilting at windmills, and coming back all the way to where I was talking about like building things for an audience that you sort of romanticize, like me making Outlook for corporations that I didn't
Right, right,
understand how
right.
they worked. It's like a young developer or technologist being like, oh, I know, I know how to fix music without understanding like the weird ass rules that are actually
Mhm.
governing the entire system, like at least that aspect of like streams and royalties and things like that. So that's what makes me so bullish on using using NFTs as a vehicle for supporting artists, where like but don't even call them NFTs, so digital merch,
Right.
or where like it's a form of patronage in the same way that Bandcamp sort of touched on buying MP3s as a form of patronage, and then giving that sort of like idea of I'm buying this thing which doesn't totally make sense, but which represents this artist I love that gives them some amount of money and I can pay however much I want. Like creating a basically creating a new culture around that. I think Bandcamp is what like kicked off a great sort of starting point of a discussion of patronage at a very kind of like accessible consumer level. And Patreon kind of like took that a level up but both of them are sort of wedded to weird models that don't make sense in 2023,
Mhm.
right? Bandcamp is like, hey, iTunes, and Patreon is like, hey, subscriptions, and both those things carry a ton of baggage. And I feel like where we are now with what we're everyone experimenting with, hey, what do we put on chain that's collectible but also is an artifact for people to refer to that's part of my body of work? Like that landscape, fresh, new, no preconceptions, is like there's going to be a native form that it's going to come up into where we're going to understand it as like, of course, that's what happens when you support an artist on chain. Like we know how much money is actually going to them, or the splits, how those are arranged, and we know that there's something. We've got the receipts. Like I purchased this NFT, other people will see that I support the artist at this level. They see how much I paid. They see what this thing means at a cultural level or whatever. Um, and that landscape, I think, is forming up right now. And that culture is what we're all kind of building as we're engaging in this space. So
Mhm.
there's a native form of music or just entertainment in general or artists in general on top of in this on-chain world. And I feel like, yeah, so far the experiments have been like very skeuomorphic. Like I think of Sound XYZ, it's like, hey, let's fix SoundCloud, throw it on chain, great. Like they're pattern matching features that have already existed, which I think is great because someone's got to do it. Someone's got to make it give people a sense of what does this feel like. But I think about how Instagram changed how everyone thinks about photography. Like it sounds ridiculous now. It's like, hey, remember that time when we put film in cameras and then you would take like 12 pictures and then put the camera away for a couple of years and then go on another vacation and finish the roll and then develop it and then make double prints. Like that feedback loop for becoming a better becoming a better photographer is like bullshit, right? How do you know how good you are at photography if you only find the results out 2 years later because you finished the roll?
Yeah.
Instagram is like you get likes, right? Early Instagram, before people were trying to clout chase on it, was a lot about like there's people seeing other people's pictures and telling them actually this is good. And getting that
Mhm.
validation makes you want to take more pictures with that terrible camera phone, which makes you actually get better.
Mhm.
And it elevated everyone's ability to be like a good photographer. Not great, but there's like it's like people know how to see better than they did, I would say 10 or 20 years ago, because that feedback loop is now there. And I
Mm.
feel like this that not it's not a one-to-one thing, but there's a similar sort of thing that's happening on chain
Mhm.
where an artist knows when you collect from them,
Right.
right? You can see who else has collected from an artist lately. And that allows culture to move faster.
Yeah. Totally. No, I agree. I mean that level of transparency, especially on the artist terms, I think, is really powerful. And yeah, also to your point, like talking about Bandcamp and it being kind of, the latest hot potato
Yeah,
in
Bandcamp's
terms
been
of
dead to me for 10 years, honestly. When they didn't put out an API, I'm like, fuck you, right? You're making your own sandbox. Live your fantasy.
Yeah.
But it feels like it's like going to an antique store and browsing.
Yeah.
It's just like why did you not like accommodate maybe some mid-century modern furniture? I don't know, like you're not like articulating your vision of supporting the independent artist in these sort of novel new ways that follows where culture is going.
Yeah.
That's following how media is developing, how artists are becoming creators across mediums beyond just like music and t-shirts. Like
Mhm.
fuck you,
Yeah.
Bandcamp. Sorry, you
Yeah,
edit
I
that
think
out later.
yeah, I once heard a rumor that they had a product meeting at Bandcamp about like once a quarter. I mean, it was obviously deprioritized in terms of like, the features that they did come out with. I think even even a bigger problem to that is the ownership layer, and we're seeing that now as to like nobody really knows what's going to happen with Bandcamp now that they don't have
It
control
doesn't matter. It doesn't
anymore.
matter.
And but I mean, one, of the superpowers that that you talk about, with the blockchain of just, like having the ownership layer, like having this, like now you can buy somebody's music and you own, like even if the platform that you minted it on goes away, then you still have that. If Bandcamp dies,
Right.
you know, like who knows
Right.
what access you'll have to, to all the music that's
Yeah.
stored in
It's
this
it's
thing.
Bandcamp is like MySpace, right?
Yeah.
It's like sorry. Remember those? Yeah, I mean, the artists have the cash. I'm glad that 90 some percent of what I paid for stuff is in artist pockets. But yeah, if Bandcamp keels over, like it's MySpace.
Mhm. Indeed. Um, okay, cool. As we're coming up to an hour, I have one more question for you, CY.
Okay.
Um, and, yeah, this is the big one that I ask everybody.
Ooh, ooh.
You're going to a desert island, and you get to bring 3 albums with you. What are they?
Um, New Order, Substance.
Nice.
Um, I think that soundtracked pretty much my entire undergraduate college life, and because I still trust nostalgia being like that sort of touch point back to a certain point of where of romanticized life I lived is like critical. Um, uh, a CD of Chopin etudes, and
Cool.
because that to me is like a connection with my family,
Hmm.
um, and how I grew up with music. And yeah, frankly, I just need those two.
Wow. Just gonna bring
Yeah,
those.
yeah.
Cool.
The third one's open ended. It's my optimism that someone will rescue me, and then just give me a like an internet connection that'll just let me get back up to date with what's going on in music for real.
Right. Okay, cool. Cool. Yeah. Yeah, I guess we'll accept that.
No,
Uh,
literally, don't make me go back into Spotify and like look at what
no,
I've had on every
that's all right.
rotation.
You're allowed to pick 2. You're allowed to pick 2.
Yeah.
Um, cool. This has been amazing, CY. Thank you so much, for your time and your thoughts. I could continue having this conversation, for 3 weeks. Really appreciate you and the work that you do. Thank you everyone, for coming and listening. Uh, for people who are listening who want to get involved, or follow along with the work that you're doing, where's a good place to do that?
So I have, I'm CXY on almost every platform: Twitter, Instagram, GitHub. You'll find me. That's the easy way to get in touch. Website is musicnerd.xyz. We didn't really get into that, but currently it's a directory of artists and collectors that I feel like is part of what's necessary as a backbone to make it easy to find, uh, basically find each other on the blockchain. Um, yeah, that's how I'd love to hear from you. I check my DMs. Let's
Cool.
talk.
Cool. Sounds good. And my last little question for you, now that you've been a guest in the show, who else comes to mind that would be a great guest to have on?
Well, I'm browsing through the audience. Jamie, Sound of Fractures, Steph, Steph Guerrero, Black Dave, Pete Rango, Ducky. These are all these are legends doing amazing work, and I would recommend having conversations with all of them. Maybe not at the same time, but yes, maybe at
I
the
mean, that
same
could
time. That
work.
would be novel.
Yeah, that
We've
would be
never been in a room together.
that would be cool. We've had Steph on the show, but none of the rest of you, although we've connected elsewhere. So prepare to get messages from me.
All right.
um, cool. Well, this has been amazing. Thank you again, CY, for being here. Again, appreciate your thoughts and your energy.
Yes. Thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely. All right, man. Take care.
You too.